In today's video, we'll be studying the ovarian and the menstrual cycle. And here we have the outline of all we'll be discussing, which is simply the ovarian cycle and the menstrual cycle. Now, the ovarian cycle involves basically three processes. Okay, so it involves the process of the development of the ovarian follicles. Okay, so we have development of the ovarian follicles. After the development of the ovarian follicles, what we have taking place next is ovulation. After ovulation, what we have is the development of the corpus luteum. So as we would go on to see, the menstrual cycle is a part of the ovarian cycle. However, the ovarian cycle, the three major processes that are featured in the ovarian cycle is first of all the development of the ovarian follicles, then ovulation, and then the development of the corpus luteum. And we'll take a look at these three steps and these three processes individually. In our video on oogenesis, we took a look at the various steps involved in the process. First, we saw that we had the primordial germ cells differentiating into the oogonia. Then we had the oogonia differentiating into the primary oocyte, all right? And then we had the primary oocyte. After the primary oocytes, we had the secondary oocytes, and then finally we had in the case of fertilization, we had the development of the ovum and then the fission of the pronucleus of the ovum with that of the sperm. All right, so this picture is simply a brief overview of all that takes place in oogenesis. Of course, we saw in the process of oogenesis that the primary oocyte begins the first meiotic division. Okay, so we had the primary oocyte, and the primary oocyte began its first meiotic division where it stopped at the prophase 1. Okay, so it was, so to say, arrested at prophase 1, and when the female baby was born, she had all the oocytes that she would need throughout her lifetime, all arrested at the prophase 1. We also went on to see that just before the onset of puberty, just before menarche, there is a rise in the luteinizing hormone level that triggers, the continuation of this meiotic division. So from prophase 1, it goes to metaphase 1, anaphase, telophase, and then it divides, of course, into the secondary oocyte and the first polar body. Okay, then it entered into the next meiotic division. Okay, so we had um next meiotic division, so meiotic division 2, and then we saw that in the next meiotic division we had the cell going through the prophase, and then after the prophase it went into metaphase. Of course, this was metaphase 2. Okay, so we had metaphase 2, and then we said at metaphase 2 the process is arrested, the process stops, and then the secondary oocyte is ovulated. Okay, so it's released into the ampulla. All right, and after being released into the ampulla, in the event of fertilization, it continues the second meiotic division, and then the pronucleus of the sperm and that of the ovum unite. This was what we saw in our video on oogenesis. If you haven't seen the video on oogenesis, please kindly check it out so we can better understand this particular video. All right, so having gone through just a general overview of the entire process of oogenesis, now we stated earlier that the ovarian cycle involves the development. Okay, so it involves the development of the ovarian follicles. Now, as we would see, the ovarian follicles are kind of like these cuboidal cells. So we can see them here in this picture as the cuboidal cells around the primary oocyte. So we have the primary oocyte looking something like this, and then we have these cuboidal cells that look something like this, just round around the oocyte. These cuboidal cells are the follicular cells, and in the process of oogen in the process of in the sorry excuse me in the ovarian cycle, these follicular cells develop. Okay, so they develop from being primary follicles, they continue growing and growing and growing, and then they grow into mature follicles and then Graafian follicles. Okay, so we have Graafian follicles, which is the mature follicle that we have here at the secondary oocyte level. Okay, now this is basically the process involved in the development of the ovarian follicles. Now, the ovarian follicles, as we'd go on to see, actually help in the production of the estrogen. Okay, so we have estrogen. Now, before we even take a look at the whole process of the development of the ovarian follicle, it's good for us to take note of two very important hormones. Okay, so basically the hypo we have the follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and then we have the LH, which is the luteinizing hormone. Okay, now as we would go on to see, the follicle stimulating hormone is actually, as the name implies, it is the hormone that stimulates the development of the ovarian follicle. Also, very important, we have two very important endocrine glands. We have the hypothalamus, so we have the hypothalamus as well as the pituitary gland. Anterior pituitary gland. Now, of course, we have the posterior pituitary gland as well. The pituitary gland has both the posterior as well as the anterior lobes. So for this video, the hormones we are considering are from the anterior pituitary gland. Now, basically, we have the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus releases the gonadotropin releasing hormones. Okay, this is known as the GnRH. This is released by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus releases the gonadotropin releasing hormones. Now, this gonadotropin releasing hormone acts on the anterior pituitary gland. Now, when it acts on the anterior pituitary gland, now just taking a look at the name gonadotropin releasing hormone, it means that it stimulates the release of gonadotropin. Okay, it stimulates the release of gonadotropin, and the two gonadotropins are the follicle stimulating hormone, which we considered here, as well as the luteinizing hormone. So when this GnRH acts on the anterior pituitary, it causes for the release of the follicle stimulating hormone as well as the luteinizing hormone. Okay, now the follicle stimulating hormone, as we stated earlier, stimulates the growth of the ovarian follicle, the development of the ovarian follicle, which is one of the steps in the ovarian cycle. Okay, and the luteinizing hormone is what triggers ovulation. And remember here, when we were taking a look at the major processes that take place in the ovarian cycle, we said first we have the development of the ovarian follicles, and this is stimulated by the follicle stimulating hormone. Then we have ovulation. Basically, what triggers ovulation is the luteinizing hormone, which is released by the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, now the next step in the ovarian cycle is the development of the corpus luteum. Now, if we take a look at the term corpus luteum and luteinizing, okay, corpus luteum luteinizing, the luteinizing hormone also plays a role in the development of the corpus luteum. Okay, so here we have the FSH, and here we have LH and LH, luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. Now let's go on to see some of these processes in detail. Right, so far we have considered the follicle stimulating hormone as well as the luteinizing hormone. And we made mention of the fact that these hormones are released by the anterior pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary gland. Okay, now the other two hormones involved in this cycle are the estrogen and progesterone. Now, estrogen and progesterone are ovarian hormones. Okay, so they are hormones produced by the ovary. As we would go on to see, estrogen is produced by the growing follicular cells. So we have the follicular cells producing estrogen, follicular cells, and we have progesterone being produced by the corpus luteum. Of course, we'll go on to see what the corpus luteum is in this video. Okay, so the key hormones, the follicle stimulating hormone, the luteinizing hormone, estrogen, and progesterone. So, of course, the follicle stimulating hormone is associated with estrogen, and the luteinizing hormone is associated with progesterone, or the progesterone is associated with the luteinizing hormone in that way. Now, what exactly are the processes involved in the follicular development? Right, so in follicular development, we have various processes or various sub processes. The first process is the development, the growth and differentiation of the primary oocyte. Okay, so growth and development of the primary oocyte. This is the first step in the follicular development stage. Next is the growth and proliferation of the follicular cells. Okay, so we have proliferation, which basically just has to do with increase, proliferation of follicular cells. And we said the follicular cells are these cuboidal cells around the oocyte. So we have them like this. Then we could have multiple layers, so they would continue to proliferate. So initially we just have a single layer, they proliferate into multiple layers. So we have the proliferation of the follicular cells. After this, we have the development of the zona pellucida, or the formation of the zona pellucida. Now, the zona pellucida is this glycoprotein layer that surrounds the oocyte. Okay, in this picture, we can see, okay, in this picture, the zona pellucida is not labeled, but we can see here in this picture, we have the zona pellucida well labeled. Okay, so it's this glycoprotein layer around the oocyte. Okay, after we have the development of the zona pellucida, so first of all, we have um, growth and development of the primary oocytes, then we have proliferation of the follicular cells. Then, all right, the zona pellucida is actually indicated here. Okay, so we have the follicular cells, proliferation of the follicular cells, the formation of the zona pellucida. Okay, and lastly, what we have is the development of the thicker cells. Okay, so they are called the thicker cells. Now, just for us to better understand what the thicker cells are, it's good for us to take note of the general structure, just a very brief general structure of the ovary. Now, in our video on the female reproductive system, we considered the ovary and we saw that the ovary is this almond shape. It's this almond shaped structure. Okay, and we said it's held by ovarian ligaments. Okay, and of course, this is basically where the oocyte develops. Now, very important is for us to take note of two terms. Okay, this is the ovarian medulla and the ovarian cortex. The ovarian cortex is kind of like the exterior part of the ovary. So if we take a transverse section through the ovary, we have a very small medulla region, which is the middle region of the ovary, and then we have the cortex of the ovary. Now, it's good for us to take note of the fact that the cortex of the ovary is actually where the ovarian follicle lies. Okay, so within the cortex of the ovary, okay, so we have the medulla here, and then we have the cortex. Now, within the cortex of the ovary, this is actually where we have the follicular, the ovarian follicles containing the oocyte. Okay, now just enlarging this region. Okay, so let's enlarge this region. So we have something like this. So we can see surrounding this ovarian follicle. Okay, so let me highlight this in red. Surrounding the ovarian follicles, we have this yellow structure. So we have this yellow structure as illustrated here. Now, this yellow structure is the stroma cells. Okay, stromal cells of the ovary. Now, these stromal cells, they are spindle shaped. Okay, so spindle shaped stromal cells, and they are fibroblast like spindle shaped cell of the ovarian cortex. Right, proceeding from where we stopped, so we have the ovarian follicles within the cortex of the ovary. So this is the cortex of the ovary illustrated here, in white. And then we stated that in the cortex of the ovary, we have these stromal cells. Okay, so we have these stromal cells that are spindle shaped and they are fibroblast like. All right, now why are we studying about the stromal cells? Now, these stromal cells, as we would go on to see, would be the cells that would differentiate into the theca cells. Okay, so thecal cells or theca cells. And it is believed that these theca cells have angiogenic properties, meaning that they have the ability to kind of induce the formation of blood vessels, so to say. As we'd see, these blood vessels would be what would provide nutritive support, or they would be what would provide nutrients for the developing follicles. All right, so just as a brief overview, we have been taking a look at the ovarian cycle. Okay, so we're taking a look at the ovarian cycle, and we said there are three main processes that take place in the ovarian cycle. First, we have follicular development, or the development of the ovarian follicles, so follicular development. Next, we saw ovulation. Okay, we haven't taken a look at ovulation, but the next step is ovulation. And after ovulation, what we have is the formation of the corpus luteum. Okay, the formation of the corpus luteum. Okay, corpus luteum. And of course, we have seen here that the FSH is the main hormone here. Then we have the LH and the LH here. We also saw the progesterone and the estrogen, and we said that they are ovarian hormones produced by the ovaries. Now, what we have been looking at so far is the follicular development. So here we saw that we have in the follicular development, growth and development of primary oocyte, proliferation of the follicular cells, and we said the follicular cells are these cuboidal cells that surround the oocyte. Okay, after that we saw the the formation of the zona pellucida, which we said is a glycoprotein layer surrounding the oocyte. We saw that here in this picture. Okay, the zona pellucida. And then the next step under the follicular development that we saw was the development of the theca cells. And we said these theca cells are formed from the stromal cells of the ovary. We also saw that the thecal cells have angiogenic properties, which means that they help in the formation of blood vessels that provide nutritive support for the follicular cells. Also, as we would go on to see, the thecal cells, okay, so the thecal cells are actually the cells that produce the they are the cells that produce androgen. Okay, now androgen is typically a male sex hormone, but androgen is also produced in females. Okay, and as we'd go on to see, the thecal cells produce this androgen. The androgen is directed inwards into the granulosa cells. The granulosa cell is also kind of like a fancy term. So we have granulosa cells, granulosa. The granulosa cell is kind of like a fancy term for follicular cell. Okay, however, the granulosa cells are kind of more mature than just the general follicular cells. Now, the thecal cells produce they produce the androgen. Okay, they produce the androgen, and the androgen is pushed inward into the granulosa cells where they are converted into estrogen. Okay, so androgen, okay, so we have here androgen is converted into estrogen. Okay, and as we'd go on to see, this process is called aromatization. Okay, aromatization. Just very important. Let me take this to a clean page. Okay, so this process is called aromatization. Aromatization, and it involves the enzyme aromatase. Okay, so aromatase converts, we have from androgen to estrogen. Okay, we would go on to see all of this, but so far we have been considering follicular development under the ovarian cycle. Okay, we haven't considered the follicular development. Okay, so we have considered the development of the ovarian follicle or follicular development. Now let's take a look at ovulation. Okay, we'd still, of course, look at all of this in greater details when we are considering the menstrual cycle. However, let's take a look at the process of ovulation. Now, ovulation is very simply put, it's the release of, most texts would have that ovulation. Okay, so most texts would have that ovulation is the release of a mature ovum into the uterine tube. However, I find that this definition of ovulation is kind of contrary to oogenesis. Okay, so generally most texts would have, just put simply, release of a mature ovum into the uterine tube. Most texts have this as the definition for ovulation. Okay, so as I said earlier, this is kind of contrary to our idea of oogenesis, and I would explain why. Okay, so in oogenesis, we saw that we have the primordial germ cells, then from the primordial germ cells, PGC, we would have the oogonia. From the oogonia, we have the primary oocyte. From the primary oocyte, we have the secondary oocyte, and the first polar body, the first PB. Okay, now this secondary oocyte is actually what has the ovum forming capacity. Okay, so ovum forming capacity. And this secondary oocyte, as we saw, would begin the second meiotic division. So the secondary oocyte would begin the second meiotic division, and it would carry on with this division. So it would have the prophase 2 and the metaphase 2. So the secondary oocyte would carry on prophase 2 and metaphase 2, and it would stop at metaphase 2. Okay, it would be arrested, so to say, at metaphase 2. And when it's arrested at metaphase 2, it's released into the uterine tube. So we can't exactly say that what is released into the uterine tube is a mature ovum. What is released into the uterine tube is a secondary oocyte at metaphase 2, not a mature ovum. But most texts have it this way: the release of a mature ovum into the primary oocyte. The ovum is only formed in the phase of fertilization. So if fertilization takes place, then we have the secondary oocyte continuing the second meiotic division. Then we have the pronucleus of the ovum fusing with the pronucleus of the sperm. Okay, so it's actually a secondary oocyte that is released. However, would stick to the popular opinion of a mature ovum. Okay, so put very simply, ovulation is the release of a mature ovum into the uterine tube. However, we would of course get to see this elaborately in this video. Okay, so We saw so far that we have this primary oocyte, so follicular development, and the primary oocyte grows and develops into secondary oocyte and so on. And not only is the primary oocyte growing and developing, the follicular cells are also growing and developing. So initially we have just one layer of follicular cells. Sorry, this diagram is not so good. But then after we have just one layer, then this layer continues to multiply. And there's a fancy term for this which is called stratified. Stratified simply means multiple layered. Okay, so multiple layer or layered or multi layered. Okay, so it continues to form multiple layers of these follicular cells. And okay, so subsequently what we would have is, as these follicular cells continue to divide and divide, we have the formation of what we call follicular fluid. So we have follicular fluid. This follicular fluid forms and they coalesce. Coalescing simply means that they come together to form a whole. So the follicular fluid come together to form a whole, and they come together to form a whole. WHOLE. Okay, and in forming a whole, they form this fluid filled cavity called the antrium. Okay, so we have the antrium, and this picture does a good job in depicting what the antrium looks like. So, of course, the follicular cells multiply, they now become stratified, and then we have the follicular fluid here within the antrium. Okay, now it's at this stage we have the antrium fully formed. Okay, so we have of course we can see here at the primary oocyte level, we can see just a very small, the antrium is beginning to form, but just very little, but then it's fully formed. The antrium is fully formed at the secondary oocyte level. Okay, so we have the antrium now fully formed. Right, so we have the antrium fully formed at the secondary oocyte level, and the follicular cells continue to divide and they form a bulge. They form a bulge on the surface of the ovary, and this bulge will develop a stigma, which is kind of like a spot. Okay, something like this, and then gradually what we have, so we have basically this are the follicular cells, we have the primary oocyte. Okay, so we have something like this: follicular cells, follicular cells, follicular cells, of course follicular cells all round, follicular cells, and then this would be the antrium. Okay, so as the division continues, eventually we have the release of the secondary oocyte. Okay, and when the secondary oocyte is released, it's surrounded by the we have what we call the cumulus oophora. The cumulus oophora is simply just layers, the layers of follicular cells that surround the secondary oocyte, and a part of the cumulus oophora would be the corona radiata, which simply means radiating crown. Okay, it's kind of like the inner layer of the cumulus oophora oophorus. And of course we have the zona pellucida. So this is what is released. We can see the first polar body here, which doesn't have ovum forming capacity and so would eventually degenerate. Then we have the zona pellucida, we have the follicular cells of the corona radiata, and surrounding the corona radiata would be the cumulus ophora. Okay. All right, now very important for us to take note of. So far we have seen the process of ovulation, okay, which is simply the release of this secondary oocyte into the ovarian tube. Okay, now we have seen ovulation, of course. Now let's take a look at the development of the corpus luteum. Taking a look at the picture that we have here at the secondary oocyte level, so this particular stage, we can see that we have the outer follicular cells, then we have the cumulus oophora or oophorus, and then okay, so at this, and then we also have the antrium. So we have something like this, just kind of drawing it out. We have something like this, and then like this. Okay, so we have all of the follicular cells layered in this way, and then this would be the antrium. Okay, so we have something like this at the secondary oocyte stage. Now it's good for us to take note of the fact that this is the only part that is expelled. So the part I'm highlighting in yellow is the only part expelled. So the question is, what happens to the remaining follicular cells as well as the thecal cells? Okay, so of course we know that the thecal cells form this capsule-like structure just around the entire follicular cell. So they form this capsule-like structure. Of course, we'd go on to see that we have the theca interna. So we have the theca interna, which is vascularized, and then we have the theca externa, which kind of has a fibrous outlook. The impact or with the influence of the luteinizing hormone, which we considered earlier, LH, this this residual follicular cells are converted, so to say, into the corpus luteum. Okay, so we have the corpus luteum. Corpus luteum. So we'd go on to see the corpus luteum is a temporary endocrine gland. Okay, in the case of pregnancy, if fertilization occurs, this corpus luteum would become the corpus luteum of pregnancy. Okay, so it's good for us to write this down. So we said if fertilization occurs, we have the corpus luteum becoming the corpus luteum of pregnancy. Okay, however, if fertilization doesn't occur, then we have basically the corpus luteum of menstruation, and it degenerates after about 10 to 12 days. If fertilization doesn't occur, it degenerates and it becomes the corpus albicans, which is this white scar-like tissue on in the ovary. Okay, now very briefly, let's take a look at the menstrual cycle. And as we'd go on to see, the menstrual cycle is actually enveloped. Okay, so the menstrual cycle is actually kind of like a step. It's a blurry stage of the ovarian cycle. Okay, so the menstrual cycle is embedded in the ovarian cycle, but we'll look at the menstrual cycle more explicitly. In studying the menstrual cycle, we'll take a look at the menstrual cycle under four phases. Okay, so we have four phases of the menstrual cycle. The first phase of the menstrual cycle is the menstrual phase. Okay, the menstrual phase. Then we have the proliferative phase. After the proliferative phase, we have the luteal phase. So the luteal phase. And lastly, this is not always considered as a phase. However, in some text, we have this as a phase. Okay, so most texts would have the phases of the menstrual cycle as the menstrual phase, the proliferative phase, and the luteal phase. However, a few texts include the ischemic phase. So we have the ischemic phase. Okay, now we would of course get to see all of these phases in more details. Now, before we continue, it's important for us to take note of the fact that the menstrual cycle is simply the period during which the oocyte matures, okay, to the period when it's ovulated, okay, so when it gets into the uterine tube. And of course, from this idea of the menstrual cycle, we can see that there's a very blur line between the ovarian cycle and the menstrual cycle. Simply very blur. Okay, however, let's take a look at these phases individually. Now, as we would go on to see, the average menstrual cycle is lasts for about 28 days. Okay, so it's good for us to take note of that. Now, let's take a look at the menstrual phase. So, what happens in the menstrual phase? Okay, before we consider the menstrual phase, it's good for us to take note of the fact that we have three layers of the endometrium. Now, of course, in our video on the female reproductive system, we took a look at the uterus. Okay, we took a look at the uterus and we said the uterus has three layers. Okay, so we have the perimetrium, which we said is continuous with the peritoneal lining of the abdomen. Then we saw the myometrium. And then lastly, the endometrium. Now, the endometrium, which is one of the layers of the uterus, has three layers. However, some texts have two layers. Now, I say three layers in total because of the two layers that some texts have, which would be the functional layer. So we have the functional layer and the basal layer. The basal layer, and some texts have this as the basilar layer. Simply the basal layer. Now, some texts simply have these layers outlined this way. So we have the functional layer as one and the basilar or the basal layer as two. However, the functional layer is further divided into the spongy layer and the compact layer. Okay, so this is why I simply say that we have three layers of the endometrium: spongy, compact, which make up the functional, as well as the basilar or the basal layer of the endometrium. Now, the functional layer of the endometrium is the part of the endometrium that is sloughed off. Okay, so it's sloughed off during the menstrual cycle. Okay, and as we would go on, we'll get to see how it's sloughed off and why it sloughs off. Okay, so it sloughs off. This is simply a fancy word for shed off, kind of shed off. Okay, so the functional layer is the layer that sheds off during the menstrual phase, okay, and it's made of the spongy and the compact layer. And also, very importantly, it's good for us to take note of the fact that the first day of menstruation is the beginning of the menstrual cycle. Okay, so the first day of menstruation is the beginning of the menstrual cycle, and this menstrual phase, which we are considering, lasts for about 4 to 5 days on average. Okay, the menstrual phase that we have, the menstrual flow. So this endometrium layer that sloughs off, of course, is accompanied with blood and, of course, the degenerated ovum. Okay, and then it passes through the vagina and out through the external orifice of the vagina as the menstrual flow. Okay, so the menstrual flow. Now, very importantly, something I forgot to mention when we were discussing the ovarian cycle, very importantly, is the fact that during the whole ovarian cycle, of course, we have the release of the follicle stimulating hormone. Now, I forgot to mention, but we have, of course, in our video on oogenesis, we said that when the female baby is born, she has all of the oocytes that she would need throughout her lifetime, and this is about 2 million. A lot of these oocytes degenerate over time, and at the end, we have only about 400 actually being ovulated before menopause. Okay, now something I forgot to mention is that when the follicle stimulating hormone is released, it doesn't trigger just one oocyte. It triggers about 20 to 50 oocytes. So about 20 to 50 oocytes actually respond to the follicle stimulating hormone and they begin their maturation process. However, very importantly is that only one of these oocytes completes its maturation and is released into the uterine tube. Of course, the remaining 19 to 49 degenerate, and this whole idea of degeneration is what we call follicular atresia. Okay, follicular atresia. So the remaining 19 to 49 oocytes that responded to the follicle stimulating hormone, they degenerate over time, they do not complete their maturation, and this whole follicular atresia is a special type of apoptosis. Now, apoptosis is a programmed cell death. Okay, so it's just very important for us to take note of this fact, the idea of follicular atresia, which is a specialized apoptosis, is a special type of apoptosis peculiar to the ovarian follicles that degenerate because they are not ovulated. Now, moving back to the menstrual phase, okay, so we stopped right here at the menstrual phase and we said the menstrual phase is associated with the menstrual flow, which lasts for about 4 to 5 days. The next phase of the menstrual cycle would be considering is the proliferative phase. Okay, so we have the proliferative phase. Now, what exactly happens in the proliferative phase? Now, a lot of different texts have different fancy terms for the proliferative phase. So, in some texts, you would have this as the follicular phase. So, we have the follicular phase, and some texts also have this as the estrogenic phase. Okay, so depending on the text you're using, if you come across follicular phase or estrogenic phase, just keep it in mind that it's all referring to the proliferative phase. Okay, most texts, however, make use of the proliferative phase. Now, what exactly happens in the proliferative phase? Now, it's good for us to take note of the fact that the proliferative phase lasts on average for about 9 days. Okay, now remember that we are working with the average of 28 days for the menstrual cycle. Okay, so for the menstrual phase, we took an average of about 4 to 5, and now for the proliferative phase, we're taking an average of about 9 days. Okay, so far we have both menstrual phase and proliferative phase, we have about 13 to 14 days. Okay, very important is day 14, as we'd go on to see in the average menstrual cycle of 28 days. Now, it's good for us to take note of the fact that in the proliferative phase, or the proliferative phase of the menstrual cycle, coincides with the growth of the ovarian follicles. Okay, and of course, we stated that the FSH, which stimulates the growth of the ovarian follicle, is associated with estrogen, because these growing follicles actually produce estrogen. Okay, now during the proliferative phase, we have a regeneration of the endometrial functional layer. Okay, so remember that in the menstrual phase, we had the sloughing off of the functional layer of the endometrium. Okay, so we have this layer sloughing off. Now, what happens in the proliferative phase is that, first of all, it coincides with ovarian follicle growth, and also we have the regeneration of the functional layer. It's very important for us to take note of the fact that the basilar or the basal layer of the endometrium remains. It is not sloughed off. It's actually what forms the basis for the regeneration of the functional layer. Okay, so it's very important for us to take note of this. Also, the endometrium is this the endometrium is, it's a mucous membrane. Okay, when we in the very first, in the video where we considered the female reproductive system, as I stated earlier, we had the perimetrium, and we saw that the perimetrium is continuous with the peritoneal layer. Very importantly, we saw that the perimetrium was a serous membrane. However, the endometrium is a mucous membrane. So we have this kind of like mucus glands. In the proliferative phase, these glands become longer, they develop. However, it's just proliferation involved in this phase. Okay, so the cells or the glands they do not secrete. What we just have is proliferation. Okay, very important. So we can see very clearly that there's just a very thin line in differentiating the ovarian cycle from the menstrual cycle, because here again we are coming to look at follicular development in the proliferative phase. So we can see that they are very closely related. Okay, so let's take a look at the luteal phase. Now, in taking a look at the luteal phase, would presuppose or would assume that the luteal phase, from the word lute, okay, is associated with the luteinizing hormone. Okay, so we have the luteinizing hormone as a key hormone in this phase. Now, also very important for us to take note of is the fact that in some text we have this as the secretory phase. Okay, so if we get to see the luteal phase or the secretory phase, it's all the same thing. And some texts are very fancy with this phase. Some texts have it as the progestational phase. Progestational. So if you're using a text that is very fancy and makes use of the word progestational, it's all the same. It's the luteal phase or the secretory phase. Some texts go further in being fancy and they call this the progravid phase. Depending on how fancy your text is, it may make use of the term progestational or progravid, and if it's very basic, secretory or the luteal phase. It's all the same. Okay, good for us to take note of the fact that the secretory phase lasts for about 13 days. Okay, so it lasts for about 13 days. So when we here we had that we from the menstrual phase to the proliferative phase we had an average of about 13 to 14, and now we have the secretory phase lasting for about 13 days, so we'd have 14 plus 13 or 13 plus 13, so on average 26 to 27 days from the menstrual phase, the luteal from the menstrual phase, the proliferative phase, and the luteal phase. And of course we are making use of the 28 days average. Okay, so what happens in the secretory phase? What happens in the in the luteal phase? In the luteal phase, of course, luteal, luteinizing, corpus luteum, they all relate. So in this phase coincides with the formation and the growth of the corpus luteum. Okay, so corpus luteum. Of course, the corpus luteum produces progesterone. Okay, so progesterone is produced by the corpus luteum. Why exactly is it called the secretory phase? Okay, so remember here when we were discussing the proliferative phase, we said that the mucous membrane or the mucous epithelium of the endometrium develops. Okay, so it proliferates, but it doesn't secrete. Okay, now in the secretory phase, this mucous membrane and this epithelial glands of the endometrium, they begin to secrete under the influence of the progesterone. Okay, what happens if fertilization doesn't occur? So at the luteal phase, of course, ovulation has already taken place at the luteal phase. Okay, ovulation has already taken place because ovulation takes place when we're looking at the average of 28 days as the days for the menstrual cycle. Ovulation takes place on day 14 to day 15. Why is this? Because on day 14 to day 15, there is what we call a mid-cycle surge of the luteinizing hormone. Okay, it's called the mid-cycle surge, and it's called the mid-cycle because we're considering the 28 days menstrual cycle. Half of 28, mid of 28 would be 14. Okay, so day 14, day 15, there's a mid-cycle surge of the luteinizing hormone, and this leads to ovulation. Okay, and of course day 14 to 15 is at the proliferative phase. Okay, so at the proliferative phase, ovulation has already taken place and the corpus luteum has already been formed. Okay, so we're entering into the luteal phase, and then we have the formation of the corpus luteum, the production of progesterone. Okay, so ovulation has already taken place. Now, very important for us to take note of is the fact that the ovum, or as we have already said, the oocyte that is released is viable for just about 12 to 24 hours. Okay, so it's viable for just about 12 to 24 hours. So if fertilization doesn't take place within this period of time, the ovum degenerates, and what happens? Okay, so what happens? Fertilization doesn't take place within this period of time. So of course ovulation takes place day 14. So ovulation takes place day 14. The oocyte is viable for 12 to 24 hours. So we'd make use of 24 hours. So the oocyte is viable to day 15. Okay, so it's viable to day 15. And then of course we have the corpus luteum. Now, if fertilization doesn't take place, the corpus luteum degenerates within 10 to 12 days. Now, adding 12 to 15, okay? Adding 12 to 15, we have 27 days. Now, this corpus luteum is actually what kind of it produces progesterone, and this progesterone maintains the endometrial lining of the uterus. Okay, so there's blood supply, okay, in preparation for pregnancy. However, the corpus luteum degenerates 10 to 12 days after ovulation. Okay, if fertilization doesn't take place. And why is this so? We would get to look at the concept of negative feedback. We have the idea of negative feedback. And put very simply, how I like to see, or how I understand negative feedback, is that the regulator, okay, so I would write this down, the regulator of the stimulus is regulated by the stimulus. The regulator of the stimulus is regulated by the stimulus. Okay, it's kind of paradoxical that the regulator of the stimulus is regulated by the stimulus, but I find that this is simply the basis of negative feedback. Okay, so when you have a stimulus that needs to be regulated, so perhaps a particular hormone is released. Okay, so we have there's a stimulus, it needs to be regulated. Probably there's an increase in temperature, we need to bring the temperature back to normal. Say for instance, a hormone is released, which is the regulator of the stimulus. Okay, so this hormone that is released regulates the stimulus. However, as the stimulus begins to drop, okay, so there's a drop in the stimulus. Now, as the stimulus begins to drop, it now regulates the regulator. Okay, so the regulator of the stimulus is the hormone. However, as the stimulus begins to drop, the drop in the stimulus now regulates the regulator, which is the hormone. Okay, so it leads to a drop in the production of the hormone. Okay, so this is the idea of negative feedback and how I understand it. Okay, now as we would see, we stated earlier that the luteinizing hormone is actually what triggers the formation of the corpus luteum from the residual granulosa cells. Now, we'd see that the corpus luteum produces progesterone. Okay, the corpus luteum produces progesterone. However, progesterone, which is produced by the corpus luteum, is actually progesterone, which is produced by the corpus luteum, has a negative feedback on the luteinizing hormone level. Okay? It has a negative feedback on the luteinizing hormone level. So, a negative feedback. Corpus luteum produces progesterone, and as progesterone is being produced, progesterone is telling the anterior pituitary, it's telling the hypothalamus, stop releasing luteinizing hormone. Stop releasing luteinizing hormone. However, the luteinizing hormone is actually kind of what sustains, so to say, the corpus luteum. Okay? It's kind of like what sustains the corpus luteum. However, the corpus luteum is saying stop producing luteinizing hormone. Stop producing luteinizing hormone. And so it can only last for about 10 to 12 days. Okay, if fertilization doesn't take place. However, what happens if fertilization takes place? We'd get to look at that very briefly. Okay, so if fertilization doesn't take place, then we have the formation of the corpus luteum of menstruation. Okay, corpus luteum of menstruation, and this corpus luteum of menstruation would eventually degenerate into what we saw to be the corpus albicans. Okay, and also if fertilization doesn't take place, there is a drop in the estrogen and progesterone level, and then menstruation occurs. However, what is the next phase? Okay, so we considered the ischemic phase. The ischemic phase. Now, what exactly happens in the ischemic phase? Now, it's good for us to take note of the fact that supplying the endometrium is what we call spiral arteries. Okay, so we have spiral arteries supplying the endometrium. When there is a drop in the estrogen and the progesterone level, this spiral artery ruptures. Okay, so we have this spiral artery ruptures, and it's actually due to what we call vasospasm. Okay, so vasospasm, just a fancy word for kind of like contraction. It's a spasm, so it's not a regular contraction, kind of like muscle spasm. Okay, but this is vasospasm, and this vasospasm actually causes for the spiral arteries that supply the endometrium to rupture. And what does that mean? This means that the oxygen level being supplied to this means that the oxygen level being supplied to the endometrium is going to greatly decrease, and this is called hypoxia. Okay, and of course, it's this hypoxia and ischemia that leads to the sloughing off of the endometrial layer. Okay, more precisely, the functional layer of the endometrium. And of course, the cycle begins again, the first day of the cycle being the menstrual phase. Okay, so it starts all over again. Now, it's very important for us to take note of the fact that the menstrual cycle in and of itself is a continuous circle, and it's not divided into phases. There's no clear demarcation of, okay, this is the menstrual phase, then this is the proliferative phase, then the luteal phase, then the ischemic phase. There is no clear demarcation. It's a continuous circle, and we only consider these phases for the sake of understanding. Okay, so we have the ischemic phase, and then we have the sloughing off of the endometrium. Of course, we said would consider what happens to the corpus luteum if fertilization takes place. Okay, so we have the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum produces progesterone, and we said progesterone has a negative feedback on the luteinizing hormone. Okay, has a negative feedback on the luteinizing hormone. Now, very importantly, it's good for us to take note of the fact that this negative feedback is actually what leads to the degeneration of the corpus luteum if fertilization doesn't take place. However, if fertilization does take place, then we have the formation of the corpus luteum of pregnancy. Okay, so the corpus luteum of pregnancy. Then we say, how comes the corpus luteum doesn't degenerate if fertilization takes place? Now, this is because what we call the human chorionic, the human chorionic gonadotropin takes over, and this is actually formed from the trophoblast. Okay, this is formed from the trophoblast of the developing embryo. The trophoblast of the developing embryo secretes this human chorionic gonadotropin, which now maintains the corpus luteum. So the corpus luteum continues to produce the estrogen, and then it basically it's sustained. Okay, it continues producing the estrogen, and it sustains kind of like the endometrial lining the of the uterus. However, it's good for us to take note of the fact that the corpus luteum is not the doesn't continue to produce progesterone throughout pregnancy. Okay, basically the corpus luteum continues to produce the corpus luteum produces estrogen and progesterone. Actually, it produces estrogen and progesterone. However, it continues to produce progesterone that sustains the endometrial lining up until about the ninth to the 10th week of pregnancy. Okay, so from the ninth to the 10th week of pregnancy, it's still the active producer of progesterone. However, after this number of weeks, we have the placenta taking over, we have the fetal liver taking over, and then we have the fetal adrenal cortex. So the fetal liver and the fetal adrenal cortex. These are the structures that take over progesterone production in order to sustain the endometrial lining. However, the corpus luteum still remains, but it's rather inactive. Okay, the corpus luteum still remains up until about the third month of pregnancy, and then it degenerates into the corpus albicans. Okay, so at about the ninth to the 10th week, it's no longer the prime producer of progesterone. The placenta, the fetal liver, fetal adrenal cortex take over that production. Okay, but it still remains, but it's no longer the prime producer. Now it's at about the third month that it now degenerates and forms the corpus albicans. Now, just still buttressing on the idea of negative feedback, it's good for us to take note of the fact that estrogen also has a negative feedback on follicle stimulating hormone. Okay, so the follicle stimulating hormone we stated earlier is produced by the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, now below a certain concentration, estrogen has a negative feedback on the follicle stimulating hormone. So below that concentration, estrogen is saying, okay, stop producing FSH, stop producing FSH. And this is why we don't have multiple ovulations. Okay, we don't have multiple. So once ovulation has taken place, there's an increase in the estrogen level, and it's a negative feedback on the follicle stimulating hormone. Okay, otherwise, if the follicle stimulating hormone continues to be produced, what would have is would have another follicular development, and would just have follicular development, ovulation, follicular development, ovulation taking place almost continually. Okay, so within the ovarian cycle and the menstrual cycle, as we have seen, the estrogen actually has a negative feedback on the follicle stimulating hormone, and that's why follicular development and ovulation don't take place continually. Okay, also it's good for us to take note of the fact that while the estrogen has a negative feedback on FSH, it actually has a positive feedback at a particular concentration. It has a positive feedback on the luteinizing hormone. Okay, it has a positive feedback on the luteinizing hormone, and it's because of this positive feedback, this is why we have the mid circle surge of the LH, which basically causes ovulation. It's the positive feedback of estrogen on the luteinizing hormone that causes the mid-cycle surge that leads to ovulation. Okay, very important for us to take note of this. Another hormone that has a negative feedback on FSH is inhibin. Okay, inhibin has a negative feedback on FSH, and inhibin, unlike estrogen and progesterone, so estrogen and progesterone are steroid hormones. Okay, so they are steroid hormones. However, inhibin is a polypeptide. Okay, inhibin is a polypeptide hormone, and it's produced by the ripening follicular cells. It also has a negative feedback on the follicle stimulating hormone. So it's very good for us to take note of this. Okay, another very important thing for us to take note of before we round up the video is of course the human chorionic gonadotropin. Chorionic gonadotropin. Now, this hormone actually forms the basis for pregnancy test. So, this hormone can be detected in the urine of a woman. If the woman is pregnant, it can be detected in her urine, and it forms the basis for pregnancy test. Of course, this is because it's produced by the embryo, by the developing embryo, particularly the trophoblast of the developing embryo. So it's very important for us to take note of the fact that the human chorionic gonadotropin forms the basis for pregnancy test. So we have studied a lot in this video, but it had only two outlines, basically the ovarian cycle and the menstrual cycle. I hope that we have been able to learn as much in this video, and so if you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching till the end. Bye.